Now let's head to Ghana, where the rising cost of living is one of the biggest priorities for the 19 million voters in the country eligible to cast their ballot in the general election this weekend. As in so many countries at the moment, the rising cost of living is top of the agenda. All the parties taking part say they'll make economic reforms a priority. The 80-year-old president, Nana Akufo-Addo, is stepping down after 2 terms in office. And among the leading candidates to replace him are John Dramani Mahama, who is a former president, and the current vice president, Muhammadu Bawumia. So in a few days following the presidential and parliamentary elections on Saturday, the country will have a new president. But at the moment, it seems too close to call. Well, for his analysis of that election in Ghana, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined now on the line from London by the former British diplomat and former director of the Royal African Society, Dr. Nicholas Westcott, who served as the European Union's managing director for Africa. He's currently a professor of practice in diplomacy at the SOAS Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy at the University of London. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Westcott, for joining us. How nice to see you again. Let me ask you first of all, clearly Ghanaians heading to the polls tomorrow in another key election. I mean, what are the issues that voters are going to be thinking about when they cast their votes across those 275 constituencies on Saturday?
You already mentioned, Charles, the question of the cost of living, and this is definitely at the top of all voters' minds. But I think both parties have a track record which leads voters to have questions about their capability of managing this. Over the last 8 years, while the NPP under Nana Akufo-Addo have been in power, we've seen Ghanaian debt balloon and cause a financial crisis a year or so ago. And that has accelerated inflation, made things even more difficult for people. But under John Mahama, who was the president until 8 years ago, again, things were not booming in the way that people would like. Ghanaian elections have always been very close fought. Each side has a fairly steady 40-45% of the electorate, and a lot depends on how the marginal constituencies, some in Accra, some in the west, some in the north, will vote. And the outcome, as you say, remains quite uncertain, but people, I suspect, want a change.
So, I mean, is there a sense that the governing party is responsible for the poor state of the economy and not external shocks? Because, I mean, that is a stick that the opposition are using to bash the government, saying that they've failed on the economy.
The NPP flag bearer, current Vice President Bawumia, has been largely responsible for the economic policy. And that has clearly not delivered what people were hoping. One of the most striking features of the last year or two has been the extraordinary increase in informal gold mining, galamsey mining as it's called, with people digging up forests, digging up cocoa plantations, because the price of gold is good and because it's a way of making a living. And this has been a real challenge for a lot of communities. It's very disruptive. Neither party has come out with a clear line on this. And I think many Ghanaians are finding it a struggle to make ends meet. Whether they hold Dr. Bawumia responsible for this, we'll have to wait and see until the votes come in tomorrow. But across Africa, incumbents have suffered. We saw that in South Africa with the ANC losing their majority. We've seen it in Botswana, in Mauritius, in Senegal. Incumbent parties have found it very difficult to win, even in Mozambique. Very fiercely contested election, still being disputed, the result. So, if you like, the odds be on the opposition to gain traction, but it will remain a very close fought duel.
And of course, Dr. Westcott, there are 12 candidates, but realistically it's between two candidates, isn't it?
Yes, the two parties, the NDC, currently in opposition, NPP, currently in power, have political machines that have sewn up a large part of the electorate. But there are one or two candidates, in particularly Nana Kwame Bediako, who would like to do what Peter Obi did in Nigeria and create a third force that comes in and takes a lot of the votes. He's standing as an independent. And I suspect there are quite a lot of people who are disgruntled with both parties. And we'll see whether that might make the difference. I don't think any of the independent candidates will win, but if they attract enough voters from either the NPP or in the NDC, it could allow the other party in. So independent candidates are not irrelevant in this election.
And in sort of the broader sense, Dr. Westcott, I mean, Ghana has often been praised for being a working democracy in a region where political stability isn't exactly rife. I mean, is that still the case? Are people still confident in their democracy, or is that starting to change? People perhaps disillusioned with the absence of the economic dividends of democracy?
That's a very good point. I mean, along with Senegal and Kenya and South Africa, Ghana has one of the most robust democracies on the continent. It's had a number of changes of governing party, presidential candidate every 8 years, more or less. There's been an alternation between the two main parties. So it seems to have quite robust democratic traditions. It has a very strong free press. It has very active civil society. There has been a peace agreement, pact signed between the governing parties saying, they will accept the outcome. So I don't anticipate the kind of events we've seen further north in the Sahel or somewhere like Gabon. People care a lot about this election. They will be upset if they think anybody's been messing with the results. But I expect it to be a peaceful process, and I expect Ghana to remain stable. But it is striking that the chief of staff of the military has announced publicly that there will be no coup here. The army will not be taking over. That he feels it necessary to say that suggests that people are asking the question.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I know that there's been some concern raised about the Electoral Commission by the opposition parties. And, in the distant past, I mean, there has been violence in Ghanaian elections. It hasn't been the case more recently. But, I mean, those are sort of, I suppose, at the backs of people's minds, isn't it?
Yes, I was living in Ghana in 2008 when there was a very tightly fought, heavily contested election. And the foot soldiers of both parties were quite active on the streets. And it was the credibility of the NEC and the then chairman of the National Electoral Commission that basically persuaded people this was a clean process. This time round, the NEC doesn't seem to have quite the same degree of public credibility. But I think we can rest assured that there will be a lot of transparency and a lot of active monitoring by Ghanaians themselves. It's not necessarily something outsiders need to do. Ghanaians themselves will be monitoring these elections at every polling station. And the free press will be holding all parties to account, including the NEC. So that's where I place my optimism that this will work out all right.
So, I mean, at the very least, because I mean, we're looking at it from the Nigerian point of view, where there's always disputatious elections and people always go to court, and there is always the sense that, you know, there's been, you know, like a lot of electoral malpractice. I mean, at the very least, is there a sense that whoever Ghanaians want to run the country will do so, that their votes will count? Because, I mean, we've seen losers in Ghana, they do accept election defeat. Unlike many other places, that system seems to work. And I wonder if that mood is still there at this time.
I think Ghanaians will still put their faith in the judicial process, even if they have some doubts about the Electoral Commission. And we've seen this in Kenya, where the Supreme Court felt at liberty to overturn the election and demand that it be run again. We are seeing the same in some other countries. So I think, I can't remember the last election that didn't get taken to the courts in Ghana. And the courts remain a bastion of independent view for the most part, and I think will take their role in ensuring the stability of Ghanaian society quite seriously, and will call it out if there is blatant, obvious and provable fraud.
And usually, how quickly after the vote can results be expected? Because they're doing both parliamentary and presidential, but I guess a lot of people internationally are looking at the presidential.
Normally, I think it will take about 3 days to get the results coming out. If it goes on much longer than that, people will get worried. They might start taking to the streets. So there's quite a lot of emphasis on that. In the past, there have been, you know, unedifying examples of failed electronic systems in Ghana. I hope the Electoral Commission have learned from past failures and make sure that the systems work reliably this time. So I think we should know reasonably soon. There have continued to be opinion polls showing that both sides winning by a narrow margin. I don't put too much faith in any of these polls immediately before the election. I think we have to wait for the real one tomorrow.
Well, I want to thank you very much indeed, Dr. Nicholas Westcott. I mean, it's great to have you on air again and to get the benefit of your analysis, although I hear you on other channels, sort of international channels, but it's great to have you back on Arise News. Dr. Nicholas Westcott is a former British diplomat, former director of the Royal African Society. He served as the European Union's managing director for Africa, and he's currently a professor of practice in diplomacy at the SOAS Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy at the University of London. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again next week. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and Ghana and, of course, London. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.